Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is March the 11th, 2018, and this is the Prairie Monk program. WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, prairies, and prairies that are leaving, glaciers, and many other things that apply to us here, that affect us here in East Central Illinois.
So is today Pledge Drive too?
No. We've still got a ways to go. What? You really want Pledge Drive? No. Enjoy. You've got an entire hour to yourself. Okay. We should mention that if you think that, as our clock here says, that it's just after 10, well, of course, since we're on, it must be 11. We did have Jumping Forward last night, which, Dave, you want to tell us about your dislike for daylight savings?
I think you leave nature as it is. And if you want to fit in with it, you construct your school organization to meet with that rather than change the time. So it's not something that I enjoy. Everyone has to readjust their time clock, and I don't think that's very economically or mentally helpful. Today I want to deal with regional planning. I'm looking at East Central Illinois. Bloomington on the west, Indiana line on the east, perhaps even into Indiana. Paxton, Kankakee, Illinois River to the north, and Shelbyville and Lesser Moraines to the south. It's probably 10-county area. We look at it as our nature and nurture. Nature means what was there. Nurture means what we make of it. And it's a large, relatively flat area. Flat because we had geological glaciation coming in from the north with continental glaciation, and it sort of planed over the water-worn landscape and the geology that's underneath. And so what you would like to have is an East Central Illinois that has some character, that interprets to itself, because it's a discovery. We've only been here for a few generations. We've come from a range of backgrounds, and we have to learn how to come from small farming in Europe, perhaps, to fairly massive farming. We had to settle down, had to put in railroads, had to deal with the water. Much of this was swamp, and so we're learning ourselves. Right now, very few people in the community really know very much about the prairie that was here. So how do you interpret the prairie to yourselves, let alone to the country at large? We should be able to also invite people from other countries to come and enjoy our nature and our nurture and have a balance between the two. And we have a responsibility to preserve some of the genetic gene pool for ourselves to work with, but also for people from overseas who might want to use a gene that we can provide. You can diddle with genes, but you can't necessarily create a plant or an animal that you might want to work with. We're doing fantastic things with biochemistry and breeding new species and cultivars, as they're called, cultivated species. And we make progress on the agricultural side of things, but we've also taken out a lot of the landscape, a lot of the nature that's on the landscape. There have been little enclaves here and there, a triangle where you couldn't turn a horse team, or a drainage ditch, or places which were prairie when they were ditched and the prairie came back in. So we have plants out there, but when you destroy the connectivity of a landscape, then it's very hard for the bird that is in one small plot to communicate with another small plot. So we're down to having wall-to-wall agriculture. First it was mixed agriculture, farming and dairying, and then that was quickly replaced by row crops, which are much more efficient in terms of use of the landscape, use of the soils. We've kind of chemicalized the soils, so you don't have a lot of nature on the farmland, except around the headlands, but more and more we have taken the little plots of land and combined them so that we can have 3,000 acres and huge pieces of equipment that treat the landscape as one. The hills get graded off and the valleys get filled so that you can do big-style landscape farming. That's not peculiar to the U.S. It's happened in Europe and other places where thousands of little farms have been taken over for a more efficient form of mechanized agriculture. And that includes the insecticides, the pesticides, the fertilizers. So we've had a huge increase in production. If you look at a graph of the yields associated with certain things, you can see one improvement when we went from horses to tractors. You can see another one when we started to use phosphates and fertilizers that improved the yield. You have another one when you look at genetics and breeding. So you've taken Teosinte, which was a little plant of corn, which with about 60 small cobs, about an inch and a half long. We've taken them to a corn that is has two or more cobs on it, and those cobs turned down so that when they were ripe, they could shed the water and not be so exposed to fungus. And they're all, if you notice, at the same height so that you can harvest easily. So we can manipulate plants, and we've done that, and the yield is great. Right now, elevators are increasing their size because the genomes that have been put into the corn to make yield have proven successful, and the yield is increasing. With that, you have to have some mechanism for getting the corn to market, whether it's at home or overseas. And those little elevators that could fill 15 rail cars have been replaced by supermarket elevators that take in a huge amount of grain and can send out 125 cars of grain at a time. So you need less of the small lines and more of the larger lines. You have a concentration on main lines. We still send out our grain and coal by manifest train. That means that it's all put together in individual trucks. But some of our produce is moving in trains that don't come apart. You load them with gantry cranes, and that train will go somewhere and encounter another hub where they'll be unloaded. So there's a concentration on main lines. Some of those short lines have been retired, and they have been watched by bikers and hikers and naturalists as places to preserve their nature. And that too has been very successful. A few years ago we were taking out all sorts of little railroad lines which were designed to be able to take in grain and have a horse move no more than about 8 miles to get to the elevator. So our elevators were 5 miles apart, and you could, if you at that time could have been sitting in a plane and looking down, you would have seen these tracks going all across Illinois, and elevators about 5 miles apart. And the little towns that went with the elevators were the same. And then came electricity with the interurbans, so you had some of these lines that had parallel interurbans. So we have an overall structure that we look to, and we've talked about over and over again, but it doesn't hurt to remind people that we're losing some of our nature, and that we could save some of it if people are aware. So Heartland Pathways was established to buy up all railroad beds and to preserve them mainly for their nature. They could double for a trail, but often the railroads came with a parallel railroad line, parallel road. The road was convenient to go parallel to the railroad line. So you don't necessarily have to have a trails through our nature. So we have been arguing about that a little bit east of here with the Kickapoo Trail, which the first phase tended to take out a huge amount of the remnant prairie that was there. Now we would like the second phase to be preserving some of that relatively original soil and enclaves of prairie. So looking at that overall situation and thinking about locals, but regionals, but national level of how do we say something interesting about East Central Illinois and how do we preserve its genetics? Well, we're sort of in the Monticello area, so let's look at Monticello as an early town, and with railroad lines running through it, and later interurbans. And Monticello is still reasonably intact. It was a font of energy for Dr. Colwell, who watched pepsin be discovered as an enzyme that should help to break down your material in your alimentary canal, whether you had constipation or you had diarrhea. It was a useful medicine that has continued to our day. So it's Pepto-Bismol in this time. So Monticello is reasonably famous for a huge pepsin factory, which started off with people on the square, Dr. Colwell, taking senna leaves and getting the pepsin, adding some alcohol and sugar, and making an elixir that was very, very helpful. So it was so popular that they took over a Piatt house, it's Piatt family in Piatt County, Piatt house on the hill right near to Monticello, and railheads coming in to service. Eventually it became an E-shaped block with the Piatt house in the middle of the E, and it's on a slope, so some part of the factory was 3 floors and some part was 5 floors. And eventually it became very efficient at providing pepsin around the world. So you had an economic history there. This Dr. Caldwell didn't want to be the entrepreneur. He was used to birthing many of the citizens in Monticello, and he wanted to stay that way. They could use his name, so the product became Dr. Caldwell's syrup of pepsin. But this was an economic procedure that was very typical of early settlement and history. So you started off with one doctor and an idea. You then had several entrepreneurs that were visualizing that this could be an economic advantage, and then the business grows to the point that it is a multinational, and it has up to 250 or 300 employees. It's part of the business of the community. You have a millionaire mile that was one of the streets that had a lot of entrepreneurs in it. People were making money. And this is an economic little piece of history. So you're looking at Monticello as an unusual town in that had this factory. A little bit more than that, other towns had the same principle. But if you're looking at history, you're trying to preserve this sort of feeling. The factory has gone, but the location is still there, the story is still there. There's the early settlement of where your rivers ran. Monticello is on the banks of the Sangamon River. So it's part of the palmate drainage of the glacial moraines. You had little rivers and creeks and swamps in the outwest plains, and then they formed rivers like the Sangamon. So we have that sort of history. And if you look at it, if you are a historian, then you're looking at that manner of use of that particular resource. You have early on, you have a grist mill. You have a long race, and you let the water get higher than a mill wheel, and then you had the mill wheel was driven by water. So at Monticello, there's a little place where you can see where they had the grindstones that would grind grain in this manner. They could also have sawmills that would allow the sawing of lumber. There wasn't much lumber. We have a flat Champaign County surrounded by Vermilion County, Piatt County, and DeWitt County that have some terrain and some forest. But it wasn't like this area was covered with forest. There were some forested areas along the rivers because the rivers allow for drainage, and a lot of our forest trees like to be near to water, but they don't like to be having wet feet. So they look for areas that are drained, and sometimes they're on riverbanks and sometimes they're on moraines that are also well drained. But we still have people who come to settle. They need lumber. They need the protection of the forest from the winds. They need to take out the forest so that they can use the soils, because the prairies were very damp, and if there was malaria there and mosquitoes, and it wasn't easy at the outset to work those territories. So we have a lumber history. We still have it. It's a temptation to take a bulldozer along the river and take out the forest. And sometimes it's rather cruel, because it's almost like taking out everything at once. Whereas in the older days, you would have had a bullock team, and you would have taken those the logs that you regarded as mature and good lumber, and even if you wanted to move them around other trees, you would have cables and pulleys, and you could pull logs out without damaging the rest of the forest. So we have a forest history. We also have settlers who had a high regard for what was there. And this especially involved women who had their houses on a prairie, near to a prairie, and they loved the prairie, and they wrote poetry about the prairie. And so you have another different sort of history. And you have a husband that would want to take out the prairie for one more row of corn and soybeans, or 10 more, or whatever. And they would be given a catalpa tree, this kind of attractive tree that grows fairly quickly, as a sop for taking out the multi-diverse prairie that was outside the homestead. So we have a culture which involves men out there working in the field. Not very easy. If you got kicked by a horse, you might just die. If you rolled into your plow, you might also die. But there's another industry. You have John Deere inventing a plow that would go through a sticky soil like Drummer or Flanagan, rich in organic matter. And so you would at first have a steam engine on one side of the field, and you'd pull plow across with a steam engine. Then you got steam engine that would move across the soil themselves, very heavy, and it's not so easy to do it on swampy sort of soils. So there's that sort of history. You're looking at the land that is left there, and so there are enclaves where, if we go to Lodge Park at Monticello, you take a drive in the next few weeks in spring, and you'll be absolutely amazed at the number of understory herbs that are there. So there's the soil filled with its bacteria and fungi and whatever, and you have to know about that chemistry, and then these understory herbs are working on that when the canopy is still open and the light is coming through. As the canopy opens up, then most of those understory herbs will disappear, but some will be saved. So it's Shady Rest, just a mile west of Whiteheath. You have a little parkland that was on the banks of the Sangamon. It's 30 acres. Up high, it's on the Cerro Gordo Moraine, and so you have upland forest, or just a representative of it. And then you have a bottomland forest, which is adjacent to the Sangamon River. And that used to be a picnic ground where you could rent a cabin, or you could come with your horse and cart and friends and relatives, and just as you these days can have a motorized home and sort of corral with 5 other motorized homes and have a friendly get-together. So in past days you could do this. So here's a little bit of history right there just a few miles from Monticello. There is tributaries. There's a Madden Creek. And then there's a railroad line that went in. And so we have to think about the railroads and how they came in and who put them in and what did they do. So now we're spreading a little further. We were looking at Champaign. We're looking at Decatur. We are looking at a railroad line that went from Champaign to Bonneville, to Seymour, to Whiteheath, to Monticello, to Cisco, to Argenta, to Oriana, to Decatur. And then we could have a train that did a circuit, and it went from Decatur up to Clinton, and then back from Clinton across past another nice natural area that's been preserved, which is called Weldon Springs State Park. It has a little spring there that feeds a lake, and it's again a place where cultural people get together and enjoy themselves. But it also has nature, and it has a rolling Hensley moraine. And so you have to know the history of the railroad bed that goes through it. And you have to know that the railroads would go down a stream and up a stream to save themselves the bother of carving out a bed for the railroad. So these creeks traversed by little trestles, and then they cross a major creek. In that case, it's a Salt Creek, and that train then can come down across the tributaries and across Salt Creek, and then up to Lane, and you had to be a knowledgeable engine driver, because if you had a loaded train, you had to go down and across that river fairly fast in order to have the momentum to get up the other side. And if you got to the top and you couldn't quite make it, then you had to spend best part of a day taking pieces of the train into Lane, and then coming back and get another piece of the train, and then putting it all together again. So you could have a history of railroading and some of the difficulties that are involved. So we're going from that area where 5 miles of the railroad bed would join Weldon Springs and Clinton Power Plant Lake to next phase is Weldon, DeLand, then to Lodge and back to Whiteheath via Shady Rest. And if you know enough about your history, places like Shady Rest would have a Chautauqua, and trains would deliver people to those Chautauquas. And Chautauqua is where you have a lot of people coming together for a picnic day. Might be an annual day. It often had a religious background, and it kept people interested and excited. And there was even a railroad siding there, and it also took in water from the Sangamon. When you had a train that was moving through, it wasn't ideal to stop in the middle of the low spot, but that was where you got your water. Later, it was realized that you should have a well up on the hill. So at Whiteheath we have well that can provide water for steam engines without you having to stop at the low spot. So that sort of history is interesting to people. People want to know about their trains. Many of the young folk that we have now have never seen a steam engine or never ridden in a train. How do we get that information to people and have them enjoy Shady Rest, for instance? It's now in the hands of the Piatt County Forest Preserve, so you have to think about organizations that came probably only about 70 years ago, So we have forest preserves, conservation districts, and they help to preserve the concept of what we're working with. So that continues. So if we go a little further, we get into Champagne. So we're working with the Champagne, Havana and Western Railroad, which has an easement on 4 miles of Heartland Pathways territory to come into Champagne with a historic train. Now, if you're going to do a historic train and you're going to have a historic steam engines are very heavy, and they have weight in a few wheels. More recently, we have diesels, and they have several sets of wheels, and you have several engines, so you spread the weight, so you can have a slightly lower weight bridge. But we're looking at a bridge for Camp Creek so that we can get those sorts of trains over. That involves also working with Top Flight Grain and Bonneville. It is Premier Grain, and those people collect grain. But they're older, small elevators on decapitated mainline. Remember that we just were talking about going from Champagne to Whiteheath to Monticello to Decatur to Clinton to back to Champagne. That was the typical route for the service train. They would pick up a car here. If you had a car over Honey or something like that, you would pick it up. You would create what is called a manifest train. It's a train of pieces that get together. And you would have a yard at Champagne where you would push those cars together to make different trains. If they're going west or east or whatever, you could sort them out. These days, the intermodal hub that we talked about a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, it will lift shipping crates that come from China or from your backyard onto a train known as intermodal. It's like a flatbed that can go 300 miles to the next hub, and then huge gantry cranes will take the product off, and it will handle things gently, whereas sometimes humping yards where you pushed a car up onto a little hill and then let it run down into one of several different rails. That could be hump and bang, and if you had a load of cameras or computers, that wasn't very kind. Most of the shipping containers are lifted gently, and so that's been a different sort of railroading. So we were doing a circle around Monticello and figuring out what sort of planning you would have over 10 counties. Well, you have 25 miles to a major university. You have 24 miles to Parkland College that handles a different level of study and research and community involvement. Both tremendously important institutions. The university is a major research university as well as a teaching university. The college level came in the 60s, and we had teams of people who were looking at the establishment of a second level of college so that people that didn't necessarily want to become academics could get information without having to invent the wheel. So that helps, and so it gives people perhaps a good idea of what a small engine is. How do you repair it? How do you replace it totally? We have become people who replace a whole thing. If your table breaks down and it needs a screw, then you go buy a new table because it's cheaper to do that than have someone to repair it. So Parkland College helps to orient people to doing things with people, nursing, to do things with mechanical things like agricultural equipment, agricultural planning, there's financing, just a wonderful array of things. How do these things relate to the fact that we have 30 miles of railroad bed in the Monticello area? Okay, let's put you in the picture. We have a diagram. We've gotten used to the fact that we are in an era when we use pictures rather than speak to you on the radio. So we have bought three segments of railbed on either end of the Railroad Museum. So there's a Railroad Museum of national level sandwiched between three of our corridors. And our aim was to preserve nature, the prairie, to provide for a trail. Monticello has 2 miles of rather wonderful trail that connects between Old Town Monticello and the suburbs to the west of the river and goes over a truss bridge that's owned by Heartland Pathways. So we've got another 4 miles there that is loaded with prairie. It has some endangered species on it. It has encouraged Allerton Park to put in some preservation area parallel to it to create habitat for rattlesnakes. We haven't seen them recently, but we know that they're in Allerton Park, and they weren't put there by the people that owned Allerton Park. They were there, and they're still there, and so that brings up a whole different sequence of people and interests. You have Forbes creating a statewide natural history that was started in Bloomington, I think, and then came to Urbana, more or less owned by the state, but then now it's part of the University of Illinois, and you have people who investigate those little pieces of prairie that we have left. At Wildcat Creek, we have a coneflower, and it's suspected that it has 3N. That means it has three sets of chromosomes. So it's slightly different. But when 3 culverts on that parallel highway were being repaired, we begged the contractors to not put the old culverts on top of the rather nice little prairie with lead plant and horipacoon and all sorts of things. We weren't successful. They put 4 feet of dumped culvert right on top of a rather fabulous little piece of prairie. So that brings up another thing. How do we surveil and look at these agencies? We have the Allerton Park next door. It's divided into the part that is the popular house and walking areas and the farmlands that support it. And so even just now we have had some questions about how do you open this up for people? Do you have a mowing machine that goes around and takes out the habitat and leaves trees? It happens. Even at Parkland College, there's a bunch of sassafras right in the middle of campus, and you have to know that those sassafras are temporary trees, and if you don't plant a new one, or you don't allow it to plant itself, that will die. So it's the same with if you're in Allerton Park or Lodge Park and you're looking at the park itself and its future. do you go in with a mower, or and what sort of mower, and who is looking at to see whether there's a vine or a shrub or a tree that may be important to save? And do you open it up? Do you plant evergreens? Lodge Park is wonderful if you go there with a car, and you don't even have to get out of the car to see the wonder and to see that the embankment for the Sangamon River is just 50 feet higher than the floodplain. And but on the other side of the road, there's a forest, an evergreen forest, and both places are wonderful. Both places you might like to have your wedding in that atmosphere, because there's very few places like that. So we also play with our natural areas, and that's a whole nother field. You have people who are getting trained to be managers of natural resources. So we're doing a circle around Monticello, and you have Allerton Park, you have Lodge Park, you have a railroad museum of national level, you have a historic city with a historic economic development. You have interurbans that parallel the railroad line and then duck down to Bement, and a Wabash rail that went across the country. So our grandparents and our great-grandparents used to work these railroads. They used to have their language. One of the words that I remember discovering was absquadulate. That meant that you could now dismount from the train. And so we had express trains, and Champaign may have had as many as 27 trains a day going through here. So you get to something like 1923, 24, 25, 26, and you have a build-up of cars. After World War I, you had trucks and tanks and even planes that taught people that they could do more than have friendly horses. There were some people who still had friendly horses. They were part of the family. But now you had this business in Champaign where University Avenue, you would have a stop for a train to go past, and it takes a while for a train to go past. So eventually they went to Paxton and took down the gravel of a moraine that was rather high. It was the highest hill in Illinois. And you actually had to have a engine waiting to push the freight train up over that hill. So it was a bugaboo from a railroad point of view, but it was full of gravel. It was dropped by the moraine. So they took that gravel and brought it down to Champaign and put in 6 or so underpasses. So the traffic, including the interurbans, could go under the railroad line and not be. This was a major railroad line. It was Illinois Central, later Illinois Central and Gulf, and it's now Canadian National. And those there is the history. If you stand in Champaign and you look at the city building, it's triangular in shape. That's because there's two different plats. There's a north, south, east, west plat across the country, and because Illinois Central went through at an angle, then the government gave the railroads money to create towns, and that is at a different angle. So you have a plat in downtown Champaign, which is a combination of University Avenue being north, south, east, and west, and Walnut Street and not Neal Street, but Walnut, and other streets that are parallel to the railroad line. So you can stand there and absorb the history right there. So we've looked at Champaign with an increasing number of people. It doesn't have enough people for a fast track to Chicago. Some people would like to have that if you could get to Chicago in a very short time with a fast track. Then that would be of interest. You could start off in Champaign and do business in Chicago during the day and then come back. Alternatively, you could take a plane and get there, but that has its whiskers on it because you have to then get from O'Hare to downtown Chicago. And but guess where the interurban train ran and where the main line Illinois Central ran? It's adjacent to they're two parallel tracks, and they go all the way from Rantoul to Paxton, and then it was intended to go to Kankakee. Didn't get to Kankakee with the interurban, but it's there, and it's loaded with prairie. It may be the site in the future for a fast railroad track that would be different from the freight track that would be maintained as Canadian National has it now. But fast track would be something different. But in the interim, it might be 200 years before something like that happens, we have an old road that was an old Route 45, and it is there as concrete and goes all the way to Paxton and then almost to Kankakee. And sometimes we would like to take people up to Kankakee because there is the Illinois River emptying out from the little rise in Chicago where some water goes to Lake Michigan and some goes to New Orleans. And so that is a glacial meltway that when it dried up, the very rich loess that was the fine material left in the dried up meltways would be blown across the state by winds that traditionally come from the west and blow east. So most of our state, including the little railroad bed and the adjacent road on the way from Rantoul to Paxton, is loaded with loess. If you go there on a wet day, your foot will slop into it. If you go there on a very dry day, it's very, very dry. So you have plants that are adapted to this. So what do we do to preserve that corridor? Then we have to think about the recreators who might like to look at that corridor and say, rail trail. And then it has to be 40 foot wide, and where does all the prairie go? So we have this little battle at the moment with the width of the Kickapoo Trail because it's taking out all the relatively undisturbed prairie on either side. So how do we as citizens ask the question of who decides that the trails should be so wide? Is it Surface Transportation Board that originates in Washington, put together by the Rail Banking Act, voted on by the Congress on both sides of the aisle, both political parties? Who set forth the specifications for this trail? And so that means another big group of people who like to look at planning and how it's done. And this is a wonderful group of people who actually look at the landscape and say, excuse me, but you can't dig a pit there because that is going to do something that we don't like there. So these bodies become tremendously important. If you go to Chicago, there's an open lands project, for instance, that works well with giving advice about how we might work with the landscape. And we as individuals can't be expert in these things, but you get together, and so we've just been to a Prairie State Conservation Coalition meeting, David and I, and wonderful stories about the history by people like George Fell and Swagman and others that have worked their lives, lawyers like Guy Frecker and others that have spent their lives doing this for not much return, but it reads sense. It has conflict. Sometimes when early Champagne decided to do zoning, there were 2 points of view. This could be wonderful to control how much spread you have, how much urban sprawl. Do you really want to put a sewer line to 2 miles, 5 miles out of town? Do you want to put electricity and water out that way? So who decides what? But then at the other end, you have someone that wants to say that who do you have the right to tell me what to do with my land? And so you have a fairly strong interest in my land and what I'm going to do with my land. And you have to think about the same thing with water. You're going to pull out of the aquifer that's underneath us, a rather wonderful Muhammad aquifer that goes through from the east side of the state through to Beardstown and empties into the Illinois River. You now have a huge cone of taking out too much water out of that aquifer, and often it's in order to produce food with agriculture that can benefit from that water, very pure water. It goes back with fertilizer and all sorts of other things that we don't want in that water. So it has to go into drains that go into the river, but they don't destroy the aquifer. So who in life tells who to do what with that water? The water may be owned by an overseas company. How do you work with the entrepreneurs who are doing this sort of thing? So I'm looking at the clock. Wow, it goes quickly. But so we're looking at a little further circle. We're going to Bloomington, and right now we have the potential for a 30-mile trail to come through on a railroad bed. And I suspect it will be a rail trail. It will be part of the Rail Banking Act, and the money to support it will be a interim trail use agreement where the railroad has the right to come back in. If you're a legitimate railroad, you can come back in if there's a factory or something where you want to service it. But my fear is that in the interim, that trail will be so wide, it'll take out the soil and the water and the plants and the insects that are on that little trail. How do we come together to discuss with the Forest Preserve or whoever what is the size? And so we have in there Surface Transportation Board at the federal level, and you have the IDOT, which is the Department of Transportation at the state level, and you have natural areas, DNR, which it has a bicycle-way division, and this is tremendously popular trails. The opening of the first 7 miles, if between Urbana and St. Joe, has been absolutely fantastic. So there are people who are looking for recreation. There are wheelchairs that don't really like to be on the open road. There are people who like to walk. And do we have anything on the side left, or do we replace it with an artificial prairie that cannot really simulate a remnant prairie? There's been disturbance. There's been a little bit of creosote here underneath the ties, and there needs to be some capping. Okay, so you can cap the creosote with 6 inches of road fill, And then you can put your chipped crushed limestone on top of that and make your trail, and it can become tremendously popular. And it is economically feasible. The restaurant at the end of that trail is making good out of the people who like to go to the trail and eat at the other end. So there are people who can communicate this way. People can ride to work. So St. Joe is a bedroom community to some extent to Champaign. So how do you facilitate those people? How do we get those people through Champaign to the other side of Champaign, and then to Allerton Park, and then to Decatur, and perhaps even to St. Louis or Indianapolis? Or how do we do like Elliot does, who has a program and he rides a bicycle across the country, 45 days perhaps to get across the country. If you want to, you can stop and you can call in at Allerton Park and find out what the history of this area is and what it will be. So you have to honor regional planners. They have to be very cautious that they're not telling people what to do with their land, but they are really. We have to figure out how to assign our railroad beds to people who think about preserving them. So we have some help from some really serious people who want to take parts of the Heartland Pathway and develop it. And we think would be a tremendous idea, because there is Monticello. There is Monticello with its history, its railroading, its nature, its Allerton Park, its Sangamon River, its Lodge Park, and we want to have the opportunity to take steam trains into Champaign. There's a gentrification in downtown Champaign, and there's X number of people sitting around and Parisianizing on the street, and we think at least some of them will want to see a train or know about it, and we'll want to hop on a bicycle and ride to St. Joe. But how do you get across town? How do you work with the North End community, which is largely black, and rides a bicycle in a different way than you would have if you're a high-speed bicycle person riding across the country? Wow, we're finished. I'm not quite finished, but that's all right. You got the message. We're interested in regional planning and how we do it. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WFT Champaign 90.1, and your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.